The following is an interview with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February 6, 2024 at about 7 p.m. in the building behind us, which is, of course, the Kremlin. The interview, as you will see if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine, how it started, what's happening, and most pressingly, how it might end. One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. Putin went on for a very long time, probably half an hour, about the history of Russia going back to the 8th century. And honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique and found it annoying and interrupted him several times. And he responded he was annoyed by the interruption. But we concluded in the end, for what it's worth, that it was not a filibustering technique. There was no time limit on the interview. We ended it after more than 2 hours. Instead, what you're about to see seemed to us sincere, whether you agree with it or not. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia has a historic claim to parts of Western Ukraine. So our opinion would be to view it in that light, as a sincere expression of what he thinks. And with that, here it is. Mr. President, thank you. On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious talk.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Remember this moment when a Nazi was invited to Canada's Parliament, when Zelensky was in town, and they did a big glad-handing session and a standing ovation? Watch this.
Zelensky's speech received at least a dozen standing ovations. There was also one for this man, a 98-year-old Ukrainian Canadian who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians during the Second World War.
Of course, there was a firestorm, and everyone wanted to know, wait a second, who invited a Nazi? And why did we give them a standing ovation? Who invited this guy? Well, remember when Trudeau came out and said this, that it was the Speaker of the House that invited them, and all of the applause that you were seeing was simply Russian disinformation.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine in Russia's illegal war against it.
But wait a second, was Trudeau correct there? Was he accurate in that statement? Was that true? Well, it turns out that was a lie.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has been claiming for months that he had no involvement in or knowledge of the invitation of a former Nazi soldier to the visit of the Ukrainian president. Now we know that he personally invited that same individual. He actually said the opposite. And he said that the former speaker had to resign over doing the exact same thing. So will he hold himself to the very same standard and admit that he's not fit for office?
We want to bring in David Creighton, who's a journalist from Canada, writes at the Post Millennial, and who has a YouTube channel as well, Creighton's Right. David, it's shocking to see that gambling is going on in this establishment. So, I mean, it appears to me that Trudeau threw his speaker under the bus.
Yeah, he definitely threw the speaker under the bus. We reported at the time that Trudeau was well aware of who this individual was, this Yaroslav Hunka, that Trudeau had actually met with Yaroslav Hunka. We had the evidence on Facebook. Hunka's daughter-in-law posted that her father-in-law had met with the speaker, the House leader, and the prime minister before speaking, or before Zelensky spoke, and he had 2 standing ovations in the House of Commons, the clip you just saw. So we knew, Trudeau knew, but now we have concrete proof that Trudeau actually invited Yaroslav Hunka to a reception in honor of the Ukrainian President Zelensky in Toronto. He was on the guest list. So if Trudeau invited him to the reception, obviously Trudeau knew he was going to be in Parliament.
Turning to Russia's war on Ukraine, now Ukrainian troops have withdrawn from the key eastern town of Avdiivka. They're blaming weapons shortages and the risk of losing vital military units as the Russians encircle the town. It's Moscow's biggest victory in months. CBC's Dominic Velitis has more.
Avdiivka has been a battlefield city really since 2014, and certainly within the last few months it became one of the most contested battle sites on the entire Eastern Front. Ukraine insists its withdrawal from the city provides no strategic advantage for Russia, but it most likely paves the way for Moscow's biggest victory since it captured the nearby town of Bakhmut last year. And analysts say the city is the key to Russia's aim of securing full control of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Now, the Ukrainian commander who ordered his troops to withdraw from Avdiivka said he acted because they were at risk of being encircled by Russian forces. And as such, he ordered them to move to safer, more favorable positions. Nevertheless, leaving the city is a bitter, bitter pill for the Ukrainians to swallow. They had a hell of a fight on their hands there, and that was made all the much harder, partly by the fact that they've been running low on artillery ammunition, which Russia has mountains of and was using against Ukrainian positions in the city. Ukraine desperately needs more weapons and more ammunition in particular. It's dependent on supplies from the West to keep fighting Russia, which has a much, much bigger military force, and it has to be said, an economy which is now really geared up for war. And that was certainly the message President Zelensky delivered at the Munich Security Conference this morning, calling on allies to plug what he described as an artificial arms shortage. Meanwhile, Ukraine is still waiting for tens of billions of dollars in funding from the United States, which, although was approved by the Senate this week, is likely to face stiff resistance from hardline Republicans in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives. That is generating some anxiety in the West. Only this week we heard from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who warned the US failure to approve that funding was already having an impact on the battlefield, as illustrated perhaps today by the news Ukrainian forces have been forced to pull out of Avdiivka after months of brutal fighting there. Dominic Velitis, CBC News, London.
American politicians and the media is mourning the death of racist and xenophobe Alexei Navalny as a hero and a victim of Vladimir Putin and his regime. Now, they're doing this to sell you a war with Russia, but if you look into who this guy truly is and how little we know about what happened to him, you will not accept this as a reason for any war. Now, Alexei Navalny died in prison today after reportedly suffering from a blood clot. The Federal Penitentiary Service of Russia reported that he fell ill after taking a walk. He lost consciousness, and medical staff did try to resuscitate him, but were unable. President Biden used the occasion for a live press conference in rare form. Every politician is ringing in with outrage, saying this shows that Putin is a madman, Russia is evil. Oh, but he was a political prisoner, the West says. He was poisoned by the Russians. He was Putin's biggest threat. None of this is true. I'm going to tell you what we do know about Alexei Navalny before he became this media darling, because it was easy to use it as a hit to Russia and Putin. Let's tackle just these 4 questions. Number 1, was he really a hero worth championing? Number 2, was he poisoned specifically by the Russian government? Number 3, was he wrongfully imprisoned? And number 4, was he actually Putin's main opponent? A lot of this comes from Jacques Baude's great book, The Navalny Case, Conspiracy to Serve Foreign Policy. So it's a great book. I'm going to recommend that you read it for yourself. But let's start with the first question, was he a hero? Even the West knows that he wasn't. Here's a Salon.com article from as far back as 2017 calling him no progressive hero. He was basically, they said, the Russian equivalent of a white nationalist. He hated immigrants. They called him the Russian Trump. They said that liberals, well, if they studied, which they don't, would hate him even more than Steve Bannon. Here are a couple things. They say he's anti-immigrant, especially when it comes from newcomers from Central Asia. They say that Putin, the people who support him, say that Putin is responsible for the destruction of Russia for allowing immigration. He has played a role in skinhead marches. He has the sympathies of other extremists. I love this tweet. It says, always a bummer for Westerners when they first learn about Navalny's anti-immigrant xenophobia and his role in Moscow skinhead marches. Does the West know this? Do they care? All of this praise, is this the equivalent of hosting a Nazi in Canadian Parliament, I wonder? So you decide. These are, of course, protected beliefs. If you want to be a racist, go ahead. But it's a free country. You're allowed to be. But at least you should know when you're supporting a racist, right? Do you know that if you're supporting Navalny? Okay, question number 2. Was he poisoned by the Russian government for being in opposition to Vladimir Putin? Well, the alleged poisoning happened on a flight from Tomsk to Moscow. His entourage said at first that it happened with tea, but the tea was brought to him by his own colleagues. There was another weird story about underwear. When no one could corroborate that, later they said it was from water bottles from the hotel. They said that they actually took these bottles to Germany for analysis, but airport security footage shows that the luggage was checked. There was never any bottles, and the German government never said that they looked through any bottles, so that was weird. And in fact, his own colleagues later retracted the water bottle story. Now, about that poisoning, they claim it was Novichok, which means little one, in Russia. Strangely enough, reports are that Novichok is a combat toxicant that remained at the experimental stage and was never actually adopted by the USSR or Russia. They noted that its high toxicity made it difficult to handle on the battlefield, meaning if they tried to poison people with it, they'd get hurt themselves. So the Soviets abandoned it, and the facilities were then converted to produce chemicals for civilian use in 1987. Okay, but guess who does have Novichok? This is interesting, and guess where it's kept? According to sources, Novichok has been found in several NATO countries, including Germany, the United States, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, and Sweden, and has been used for the purpose of research and the development of antidotes. As early as 1990s, the United States has filed nearly 140 patents on chemical weapons of this type. And as early as 1998, the American Chemical Weapons Laboratory in Edgewood synthesized Novichok. And according to this former FSB director, a small stockpile of Novichok existed in Ukraine. Huh. Okay, but suppose someone in Russia did get their hands on some Novichok and used it to poison Alexei Navalny. Well, this is known as an organophosphorus toxin, which means it disrupts the functioning of the muscles, and it's irreversible. You seize up, and then you can't reverse that, basically.